Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a literally earth-shattering piece of modern history, how the absolute largest superpower on Earth, a nation spanning 11 time zones and encompassing nearly 300 million people, suddenly shattered into 15 entirely different nations.
Okay, let's dive into this. There's a brilliant old saying, houses don't collapse in the rain if they haven't had cracks for years. And you know, the dissolution of the USSR in 1991 absolutely was not an overnight accident. It was the inevitable collapse of a massive foundation that had been secretly rotting from decades of corruption, economic stagnation, and deeply suppressed anger. From 1985 to 1991, some very specific, highly detailed incidents severely weakened the roots of the nation, completely setting the stage for one final blow to bring the whole house down.
Picture this. It's Christmas Day, 1991. The events were just surreal. In the evening, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev officially resigns. That night, ordinary citizens actually braved the freezing Moscow winter to witness history. They stood there as the Soviet red banner was lowered over the Kremlin for the absolute final time, and the Russian tricolor was raised in its place. Millions of people lit Christmas candles that night, and honestly, they looked more like the flames of newfound freedom. Later that very same night, U.S. President George H.W. Bush got on television and announced the end of the Cold War. But to really understand the gritty, realistic details of how we reached this monumental climax, we have to look back.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The birth of a giant. 2. Stalin's brutal iron fist. 3. The cost of superpower ego. 4. The double-edged reforms. 5. Grassroots protests erupt. And 6. The final collapse. We'll trace the chronological cause and effect from those 1917 origins right up to the dramatic civilian uprisings that literally redrew the world map. All right, Section 1, the birth of a giant. Let's look at the foundation of the USSR to understand what their original ideological goals actually were.
The story kicks off in 1917, right in the middle of the bloody, exhausting late stages of World War I. Vladimir Lenin enthusiastically led the Bolshevik, or October, Revolution, successfully overthrowing the Russian provisional government. Fast forward to 1922, and the Soviet Union, the USSR, is officially established. Lenin managed to unite 15 distinct republics, places like Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, creating the largest nation by landmass in the entire world. Now, Lenin's original ideology was to unite the working class under a true democracy, but he passed away in 1924 before that vision could ever really materialize.
Moving right along to Section 2, Stalin's brutal iron fist. Following Lenin's death, those initial democratic ideals evaporated into a horrific authoritarian reality.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this massive, deeply chilling number, 18 million. Under Joseph Stalin's absolute single-party rule, stepping even slightly out of line meant vanishing, just gone. An estimated 18 million people were forced into the gulags, a sprawling network of brutal labor camps. These weren't just standard prisons. They were a frozen hell on earth. Captive citizens were literally worked to death, mining and logging in sub-zero temperatures. Stalin pushed this aggressive, rapid industrialization and forced the collectivization of farms. The state just stripped grain directly from the countryside. This directly triggered a devastating famine in the 1930s where millions of civilians literally starved in the streets. Society was gripped by absolute terror. People used to say that not a single leaf moved without Stalin's permission. It was this intense, absolute paranoia and fear that paralyzed the population all the way until his death in 1953.
That leads us right into Section 3, the cost of superpower ego. Following the Second World War, the 40 to 45-year Cold War severely deepened the hidden cracks in the Soviet foundation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolutely jarring contradictions of the era. On the world stage, the USSR looked unstoppable. They were launching Sputnik 1, sending Yuri Gagarin into space, building massive intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the domestic reality? It was incredibly bleak. State treasuries were bled completely dry. Severe inflation took hold. Everyday citizens were standing in line for hours in the freezing cold just to get a basic loaf of bread, all while their government funneled everything into a massive military and space race. While the state poured billions upon billions into funding foreign communist parties globally and building up massive nuclear arsenals, the domestic economy was basically in freefall. The GDP was dropping sharply well before 1985. Decades of unchecked rule created this deeply rooted corruption. The elite party insiders, known as the nomenklatura, they looted the system and lived in total luxury. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered in the dark, watching neighboring European states grow more and more prosperous.
This brings us to Section 4, the double-edged reforms. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became president, stepping up to save a sinking economic ship. Gorbachev introduced two exact mechanisms to try and fix the massive cracks in the system. First, Glasnost, which translates to openness. Suddenly, banned books were available. Citizens could speak without constantly fearing the secret police, and around 100 political dissidents were suddenly freed. Second was Perestroika, or restructuring. This policy allowed for economic privatization, private business ownership, foreign investment, and even democratic elections. But here's the catch. Giving people a partial taste of freedom is incredibly dangerous. It accidentally uncorked decades of explosive, suppressed anger and deep resentment toward the state.
Which takes us to Section 5, grassroots protests erupt. That partial freedom instantly triggered a hunger for full independence.
Localized uprisings erupted like wildfire. I mean, look at this timeline. July 1986, the anti-communist Helsinki 86 group forms in Latvia. By December, hundreds are protesting at Riga's cathedral, literally chanting for Soviet troops to leave. That very same month, in Kazakhstan, hundreds of students clashed violently with military troops in the streets for 3 solid days. By 1987, thousands were marching across the Baltics, forming massive human chains to demand independence, and when the Berlin Wall finally fell, with East Germans so desperate they were literally jumping from windows to escape, the Soviet security forces largely just stood by. The spell of fear was completely broken. They had lost total control. And now we arrive at Section 6, the final collapse, the absolute climax of our narrative, where the government completely loses its grip. Let's move to and see how this built. The ultimate breaking point came during the infamous August coup. Communist hardliners, totally terrified of losing power, placed Gorbachev under house arrest. They declared a state of emergency and rolled literal military tanks directly into the streets of Moscow. But here is the turning point. When ordered to fire on the massive crowds of protesting citizens, the army refused to shoot their own people. Boris Yeltsin famously climbed right on top of a stalled tank to lead the resistance. Right then and there, power had officially shifted to the people. After that, the final dominoes fell incredibly fast. On December 8, 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus officially annulled the original 1922 USSR treaty. On December 25, Gorbachev formally resigned. And the very next day, December 26, 1991, the USSR formally dissolved. It was such a jarring reality. Millions of people went to sleep in the Soviet Union and woke up as citizens of 15 entirely new independent nations. They suddenly faced a massive economic survival crisis without centralized money or resources, forever altering global geopolitics. So, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over. The USSR fell because its leaders completely ignored the cracks in their own foundation, letting corruption and immense military spending rot the nation from the inside out. When you look at today's complex geopolitical landscape, what modern superpowers might be making the exact same mistake? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning history, and I'll see you next time.